Welcome to the Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk featuring Tori Whitaker in conversation with Karma Brown to discuss Millicent Glenn's Last Wish. I'm Kate Whitman, and I'm Vice President of Author Programs and Community Engagement for the History Center, and I'm so glad that you're joining us. You can purchase copies of Millicent Glenn's Last Wish at the link in the chat box to the right of your screen. They are being sold by our official bookselling partner this evening, Foxtail Bookshop. And the link is also provided at the History Center's website. As Tori and Karma are talking, please submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Karma will get to as many of them as time allows. And now to introduce our speakers. Tori Whitaker grew up in the Midwest. She now resides outside of Atlanta, Georgia, where she and her husband of more than 40 years live near their two sons and their families. Tori belongs to the Historical Novel Society, and her feature article, Multi-Period Novels, The Keys to Weaving Together Two Stories from Different Time Periods, appeared in the Historical Novels Review. Tori graduated from Indiana University and is the Chief Marketing Officer for a national law firm. She's also an alum of the Yale Writers Workshop. Millicent Glenn's Last Wish is her first novel. Karma Brown is an award-winning journalist and best-selling author of the novels Come Away With Me, The Choices We Make, In This Moment, The Life Lucy Knew, and most recently, Recipe for a Perfect Wife. In addition to her novels, Brown's writing has appeared in publications such as Self, Redbook, Canadian Living, Today's Parent, and Chatelaine. Real quickly, I just want to say that this event is 4 years in the making. I met Tori Whitaker at an awards ceremony and was lucky enough to sit at her table. I think she had just finished Jocelyn Jackson's writing class. And so she told me she was working on something, and I made her promise to let me host her when it came out. So I'm very excited to be doing that this evening. Thank you both for being here. And Karma, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kate. And I'm really happy to be here and to be in conversation with Tori about her amazing debut, Millicent Glenn's Last Wish, which I loved. So let's just jump in right away, Tori. If you can just tell me what this book is about.
Thank you, Karma. And I'm so glad I get to meet you virtually because I loved your book that came out recently too. And it happens to be set in the 1950s as well, with a dual time period. So it's fun for us to get to talk, I think. Millicent Glenn's Last Wish is about Millicent, who, when the story opens, is 90 years old. And it's set in Cincinnati, where I was born, although I live in the South now. And she has a couple things happen to her that will trigger memories to go back 6 decades. First of all, her daughter, who's 60-some years old, comes back to town after being away for 20 years. And she says that she's moving back to Ohio to stay. And that comes as quite a surprise. The two women have not gotten along that well over the years. And then the second surprise is her granddaughter, Millicent's granddaughter, who's 38 years old, comes on the scene. She lives locally, but she announces that she's pregnant. And both of these are really great news, but taken together with her birthday coming up to be 91 years old, her memories come really much more to the forefront. And the story then goes back into time. And ultimately, this novel goes back and forth between past and present. And in the historical narrative, it is the post-war early baby boom period of the late 1940s and the early 1950s. And ultimately, Karma, I think it's a story of 3 generations of women. And it is a story of one woman in particular, Millicent, who in the 1950s wanted it all. She wanted a home and a family and a career. And society wasn't quite ready for that yet, nor was her husband.
Yeah, she's one of those characters who is really hard to forget, Millie, especially because, often in books, you see the women and the characters are in their 30s and their 40s, and there isn't as much representation for women who are older. And Millie's 91, when we meet her in this story, and she has lived this whole life and had the most interesting life and a lot of tragedy. She's flawed, but she's strong. So she was just such a fun character to spend time with, but also very, she made me think of myself, of my mom, of my grandmother. Like it was just, she was a wonderful character.
Oh, I love hearing that so much. Thank
Yeah,
you.
no, it's nice to read about women at all stages of life. And, with Millie, we got to see her through a lot of those stages of her life. So you get a really good sense of who she is.
Thank you.
I wondered, this is sort of a two-part question, and you can answer it however you like, but one, what really inspired you to write this book? And maybe taking a step back from that, what made you decide you wanted to write a novel? This is your debut. It's your first novel. And so, what made you want to write a book in the first place? And then what inspired you to write this one?
Oh, okay. Well, I'm one of those people where I fell in love with history. And that was even before I fell in love with writing. I think I was 5 years old when I went to a museum in Detroit with my grandparents. And I remember standing in front of a Ford Model T. And from then on, I've loved history. And then I guess around 7th grade or so in an English class, I thought, I'm really enjoying writing. And then ultimately, I studied journalism in the high school program and I minored in English in college. And really, though, it wasn't until my 20s that I decided I wanted to write a book someday. But it was a long time until I started it. I was in my 40s and my children had left the nest and gone off to college. And I decided now's the time. They're gone. I'm going to spend my personal time because I have a full-time career too. But I decided to spend my personal time, and my husband was very supportive with me writing. And yet, even though I was very mature adult, I was very naive too. I didn't know how hard it was going to be. And I wrote 2 whole novels before I wrote Millicent's story.
Same.
And finally, my 3rd book got published.
Yeah.
So, in terms of what inspired this one, though, I think a lot of things came into it. I like to write the kinds of books I like to read, and also becoming a grandmother and having my grandchildren grow. I think part of me was like, I need to leave something to them, especially having a granddaughter. And my story is on some level, as I said, about a woman who wanted it all. And there was an imbalance of power really in the 1950s, that slice of time in between the 40s with the optimism and the victory of war and everything. And then the 60s, where we see a new wave of feminism and really, social unrest and fight for civil rights and everything. In that 50s, it was not really all June Cleaver and Leave It to Beaver or Father Knows Best. So I think part of me was inspired by that. But I guess the final thing I'll talk about here was that there was also a memory that I had going back to when I was a little girl, 4 or 5 years old. And I had been at a huge family reunion. And by the way, I was born in Cincinnati, lived there until I was 10. That's where this book is set. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier, but I overheard some people talking about something that had happened to a woman. And it created this image in my mind I've never been able to shake. And decades later, what I heard became the pivotal scene in this novel, the one that forms the secret that Millicent has held all her life, and now she's going to tell her daughter and granddaughter the secret of her life. And everything else in the story is out of my imagination now and completely fictional, but for what happened there. And it's a spoiler, so I won't describe what that was.
I won't describe it either, but I will say I know exactly what you're referring to. And it was incredibly disturbing and evocative and just, I wondered if your story centered around some experience or something to do with that moment, because I find a lot of times with authors and with books, there is often this sort of anchor, that exists inside of their story that everything else gets built around. And I had a moment when I read that where I was like, I wonder if this was the moment for Tori that anchored this. And we can't, of course, share what it is because it is a spoiler. And as you said, it relates to the secret and to her wish, really, her last wish. Speaking of the details and the historical elements, I mean, there were so many great historical details in this story. You could tell that you had done your research. It really was easy to be in that time and place. And I know how hard it is to try to get it right, especially when you haven't lived through that particular era, having written a book also that was set, half of it was set in the 50s. So what did you have to do in terms of research to try to nail not just the details of setting and place and time, but also the nuances of language and food? What was that experience like doing that research?
Well, I really appreciate your kind words about the historical detail, because you too, your book was so rich in historical detail. I loved it. Mine had already gone to the final draft to the publisher when yours came out, and I was just bowled away. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm feeling this book of yours.
Thank you.
Well, I did a big sweep of the period, and given that Millicent was a young wife in that post-war time, I kind of had to go back earlier, even to her childhood, because of how her childhood really helped make her who she was. So I had to go back to the 20s and 30s on some level too. But I did a deep dive into the late 40s, early 50s, and I read histories that women had written themselves during the time. And I looked at magazines that I was able to purchase that came out during those years. And besides looking at all the social kinds of things and the food and the fashion and all, I took two kind of deep dives on two areas that aren't necessarily in a lot of books by that period. And that is the housing industry. Prefabricated homes were important during that time because the service people were coming home from the war. They were starting families, getting married young, having babies, and they needed houses because the construction industry had basically stopped for so long. And so, long story short, a prefab home could be delivered to a lot in a kit and constructed within 1 week, and a family could move in. It was a trend that lasted only really into the early 60s.
I remember actually reading
that was fascinating.
Yeah, I remember finding that in some of the work when I was just trying to figure out what house they lived in. I did a deeper dive than I needed to into that, because that's what happens, right? When you're researching a novel, you find yourself going down paths that you didn't necessarily need to go down, but it's interesting, and you never know when you'll find that gem. But
and I brought that into how Millicent and her husband started a dealership that built these prefab homes. And the other thing I did a deep dive into was maternity care, both in the contemporary time with the granddaughter and her pregnancy, and the historical period. And the mid century, it was the baby boom. And we might tend to think of baby boomers being at retirement or close to it right now. But when they were being born, it was a baby boom because there were a lot of babies being born left and right, and not just in this country, but other countries after the war too. And so hospitals were overcrowded, and there was a shortage of doctors, and some hospitals had large maternity wards where you could have many women in labor at once. And also during that time, cesarean sections were still rare, like about 1 in 50 births. But today, resources say that a cesarean section in a hospital is 1 in 3 births. And so I enjoyed looking at how those kinds of things compared across 60 years.
Yeah. And, you did, speaking of we were talking about the historical details, but there's also a whole modern storyline
Yes.
in this book. And so you've crafted dual narratives where you have, and dual timelines, where you are looking at 2019 and then the 40s and the 50s, and you get to see her life, but then the results of what that life looks like for Millie and her daughter and her granddaughter. So what is your approach? I mean, I love doing the dual timeline and the dual narratives. I'm sticking with that for a while going forward, but it is tricky. And I have found that authors have different ways of attacking that particular challenge. So for you, how do you manage the jumping from the past to the present and keeping those threads going?
Well, I'll be really interested to hear what your process is too. But while some authors will write one of the storylines from start to finish, say the modern thread all the way through, and then go back and write the historical narrative all the way through, and then others go back and forth all the way without even having an outline and just go all the way to the end. I'm sort of in between that, and I wrote a few chapters in the contemporary storyline and a few chapters in the historical, and then wove those together and went back and forth through the book that way. I did start with a rough outline. I'm kind of a planner. I knew where I thought the book would end up, but there's just so much that goes into, there are things that change as you go, and I love dual timeline books too. But they are a challenge to write. I mean, you're basically writing two stories in one novel. And when one thing changes in a time period, then you might have to change something in the other time period to get the chapters to,
Work.
mesh. And it can drive you a little crazy sometimes. But
Yes.
ultimately, I love the interplay between past and present. So what do you do, Karma? I mean, how do you approach it? You did such a great.
Well, I did this with Recipe for a Perfect Wife. It's similar that my characters are 60 years apart as well. They live in the same house, but these 6 decades apart. And there's a cookbook, a vintage cookbook that becomes a very important part of the modern day woman's life. And so for that book, I had an outline similar to you. I had an outline, a rough outline that I did veer off of here and there. But I wrote the chapters back and forth, and I went from past to present to past to present, mostly for that book because what was happening in each timeline was actually quite dependent on what had come before, because there was a consecutive storytelling that related to the recipes in the cookbook, and as the story unfolded, you sort of had to see it playing out across both timelines. I'm doing another one now, another dual timeline for my next novel, but I'm actually doing what you did, which is I'm writing the modern day character first, and then I'm going to write my 1970s character after, and I will figure out how to mesh them together. But like you said, the jumping back and forth, I think it can be hard. You're trying to get into that 1950s mentality, and then you're in the 2019 mentality, and the language is different and the texture is different, and so you can drive yourself a little crazy trying to jump, right?
Yes, it can be. I mean, it involves a lot of revision. Let's put it that way. When I finally got it where I thought it should be, then I read one whole narrative at a time in one full swoop, each one, to make sure that each had their own arcs and so forth. But and like you say, that in the modern narrative, the characters there, the daughter Jane and the granddaughter Kelsey, they sort of have their own mini arcs too. I mean, they have other things going on in their lives, and then in the historical part, you're trying to balance out the different kinds of foods that they ate. By the way, I love the recipes in your book. For readers that don't know, Karma's book, every chapter of the historical period starts with a recipe of the period, and they're fascinating. That was one of my favorite parts.
Thank you. That was one of my favorite parts to write too. I love vintage recipes and vintage recipe books, so that was fun. You know, there is something fun about picking a time period that you are really curious about, so that you get to, because you
Yeah.
spend so much time in a book,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
With revision and making sure it all fits. But you know, one of the things that I really explored through recipe was the societal expectations that were on women in the 1950s, you know, the quintessential housewife,
Mhm.
and also then comparing and contrasting that to what life is like now for women,
Mhm.
and that question of have we come as far as we think we have.
Mhm.
And similarly with Millicent Glenn's, you are looking at, you know, a similar time frame, right? That's 60 years, and you're looking at women's ambition and career, you know, motherhood, how that's changed and how it hasn't. So, you know, I had my own perspectives before I started writing and after I finished writing that
Totally.
book. And I'd be curious to hear what that was like for you, either why you focused so much on women's issues for this story,
Mhm.
and what maybe was a surprise to you as you worked through those two different time frames.
Oh, wow. You know, I think, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier. Um, Once I had a granddaughter who, you know, she's getting close to being a teenager now. And so women's issues in some way are more important to me now, even than they were before she was born. But, and I think that sort of played into it. Um, I do feel like women have a lot more options today than Millicent had. I mean, Millicent wanted to work outside of the home and have a job, and she did for a while. It was really only after her children came along that,
Which was very rare at the time for a woman to
yeah.
be working outside the home, right?
But her husband then really wanted her to pull back and
Yes.
not do the work outside of the home. And then in my book, Kelsey, who is, as I say, in her 30s, I mean, she's wrestling with what she'll do after her baby is born. Will she continue to work? She is an archivist in a history museum. Will she work part-time? Will she be able to work remotely and work from home part of the time? Or will
Right.
she stay home? And I think my story is very much one of women having choices about what they do with their careers, if they have the means to have choices. And it's a very valid choice to stay home and be full-time mother, or stay-at-home mom, or whatever you want to call it. And it's something I did for a long time. I mean, I've been on both sides. I've been a full-time mother and homemaker. I've been a career woman. I've been, part-time in between. And I think women can have multiple choices there. And so that is a big difference between the two periods.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see what I mean, I had similar thoughts too. I have a 12-year-old, and so I have always been a working mother, even though I work in the home, and then I'm writing books, but I'm still home with her when she was growing up. You know, I did find that perhaps we do have more options, but there is still a lot of constraints on women, and in terms of women's ambition, and how do you balance those things? How do you balance having children and
Mhm.
having a career? And so a lot of the challenges, you know, I loved that Millie was so ambitious, and she wanted this to work outside of the home at a time where women just didn't do that. But it was such a driving force in her.
I'd
And
like to speak to that. Really, the question is, why was she like that? And someone that I worked with developmentally on my novel a few years ago, she asked, why is Millie this way, so driven? And it went back to in Cincinnati, in this fictional family. Um, Cincinnati in the late 1800s, early 1900s being a real brewery city. And then when Prohibition came along, all of the brewers and all the suppliers of the brewers and everything lost their careers. And her family in my story is of German descent, having come over in the 1800s, her family. And Then when they lost their homes and everything in the 1920s, that really put her family in a big hurt. And then her father died really when she was too young to remember. And so her mother really instilled in her, you can't really depend on a man. You must always have your own way, and find something you can do in this life. And that's really what drove her initially to want to earn money.
Yeah. Yeah. And it almost, then it grew from there, of course, where
Yes.
she wanted to have security of her own, but
And
she
her
also
fulfillment.
realized, what was possible with doing that. And she liked it. She wanted to do it above and beyond the money. And that was I loved that part of the story and that thread for her, because it was unusual, but it was nice to see how that played out and how she really pushed for that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. There is a question here from Gail, so I'm going to read it out and then you can answer, okay? Tori, what do you know now that informed your character development, plot, and or story arc that you didn't know as a 20-something woman who dreamed of writing a novel someday? Are you glad that you allowed the story to gestate until this stage of your life? It's a great question.
Mm-hmm. That is a really insightful question, and it's an emotional question. I will be very candid. When I was in my 20s, at that time, I really hadn't seen tragedy. I had heard this memory, as I said, from when I was a child, but that was, I was kind of distant from that in some way. But it's really not until you see people you care about, whether it's a friend or a loved one, go through something really bad, where you see life can be bad. I didn't really have that observation and that personal experience with someone I really cared about, having gone through life's trials until I was older. And so I think really when I started writing this book 5 years ago, some of that came out too. Having, the longer you, and I guess for some people it happens earlier in life. Maybe they are a child when they first see something really close happen that's tragic. But for me, it was later, and part of those things were in between the lines of this story.
Yeah. I and sometimes you need some space from that. I mean, my debut came out when I was 41, and
Really?
yeah. And I think that for me, it was similar in that I had quite a dramatic thing happen when I was 30, when I had cancer at 30. And so, even though I had been through that young, it did take some time to process it and to look back on it. It's the same, like motherhood is such a theme through your story. But it's the way that it read to me is motherhood that is understood not as, okay, I have a screaming newborn, the challenges of what that feels like, the joy of this little person arriving in your life, but it's also the complexity of being a mother, of like decades of doing that and watching your children grow and make their own decisions. And so, that was a very authentic part of, for Millicent, for sure, with her daughter, with her granddaughter, with her wish for what could happen for them in the end. And so there is that maturity and that life experience that I think really does sort of come through for in this book. And like, speaking of women and motherhood and friendship, like, I think it's one of the best and most obvious themes, I guess, through your story is this idea of female friendship, the strength of women, the way that women hold each other up and support one another, especially with Millie's friend Pauline, being there for her all the way through.
I love Pauline.
I know. I loved her too, and I just thought that she was such a great addition to Millie because she sometimes gave her the boost that Millie needed to be able to do the hard thing, to do the next thing. But why was it important for you? I mean, do you have a lot of strong female friendships? Was this an important
Yes.
thing for you to put in?
Yes, I do. I have those. And also, um, I liked what you said earlier in the segment about Millicent being flawed but strong, and it
Yes,
was important to bring flaws into these women,
of
but their
course.
strength. I mean, ultimately, they're three women who are survivors, and I think we like to read stories about survivors. And there's this other thing that I've kind of danced around a little bit here, but I'll just put it out there. When I was born, I became my family's fifth living generation. And that's a little uncommon. But then when my grandchildren came along, my family had five living generations again, and that's really rare. And so it's very much a part of me. It's beyond the way I think. It's just the way I am about these, thinking in terms of generations. And so as my grandchildren are growing, I mean, I become even more cognizant of, what will I leave to them? And I don't mean physical things. I mean, it can be lessons in life, say. But that they bring me so much too. But one of the things was, I wasn't going to give up on getting published because I set that as a goal. And I thought it was important to show them that grandma wasn't going to give up,
Yeah.
So all of that strength of friendship and women and generations does, I think, come out of me in ways that it's not like I planned that consciously, if that makes sense.
It does. It's part of, I mean, and when you're writing and when you're an author, you're always minding your own life and your own perspectives, even though your characters are fictional and you are giving them their own stories and their own issues and their own relationships, you're still, some of what you have felt or thought or considered through your life gets put into those characters, right? I think that's one of the things that makes a character feel so true to life when you read them. Like Millie, she just, one of the best legacies she's going to leave her great grandchild is this idea that you can make mistakes and that you will make mistakes, and that even at 91 she was still making mistakes in her relationship with her daughter and trying to find that balance of forgiveness and understanding.
I love the way you phrased that. And I saw where that came out in your work too, where there was female friendship. Your main character in the modern day was friends with a woman who was much older.
Yes.
Not the woman who had lived in the home where she found the vintage cookbook, but another woman. And also your character is, she makes mistakes too. And I mean, we don't want to read about a perfect person, I don't suppose. We want to see growth. And I think we want to see growth or at least change in a character over the course of the story. And in Millicent Glenn's Last Wish, I tried to do that not only with the women, but with Dennis, Millicent's husband. He's very much a man of his time, but he too has some growth, I think. I think it's the readers decide what they think of him in the end, but he's not static.
No, I actually found him to be a little bit of like a feminist, like a small f male feminist back at he had growth.
If he is, that's because Millicent's influence on him.
Yes.
Maybe his mother's. I also love the character of Mother Glenn.
She was a great character, just so strong, but also so warm and, really that mama bear kind of character for Millie too. To just be there with her through everything without flinching.
Through everything.
She was a great character. We had a
Great.
lot of great characters. I have another question here from
Okay.
Kelly. Congrats on your beautiful book, Tori. This is a very strange year to debut in, and there has been a lot of focus on how hard it's been to promote a book right now. All that said, I'd like to know what you'd say has been the best thing about releasing your first book into the world. Great question.
Yeah, it is. And it came as a real surprise to me too, what this best thing was, because all the years that I've written and all of those times I faced rejection and all those times I overcame obstacles to get this book published, sitting here in my office here at home, writing or researching or drafting or revising, that part is, aside from critique groups that I think are very important, it's a very, you do it in solitude pretty much.
Yeah.
It wasn't really until the book came out, or was soon to come out, because it got in some advanced readers' hands for advanced reader reviews and stuff. But it wasn't really until readers read it and had an experience with the book and began sharing their experiences with me on the things that resonated with them and how they felt about it emotionally. It is an overwhelming experience as a writer. And it's just one I could never have known how it felt until the book came out and was read by people whom I've never met in states or other countries, far away. And them reaching out to me, so that I'm not in, I'm not there live at the Atlanta History Center tonight, where we can have people bringing the book and get it signed and everything. But I haven't felt slighted, I guess is the only word I can think of at the moment, because I feel blessed and I feel grateful. And I have been so overwhelmed by the readers and how they've interacted with me.
Yeah, that is one thing, because as you said, it is so solitary. And you spend, like you, I have 2 books that I wrote before my debut was published that are
did you?
tucked away. They're my practice books. So
And the book's in the drawer.
The books in the drawer, which help you get that book out on the shelf.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just, there is a lot of stuff that you don't know that will happen and does happen. And suddenly, the book is, I always say, the book, once it goes out, is no longer my book. And
Heard that before.
yeah, and I really do believe that, because people read it, they have their own experiences and reactions, and most are amazing. Some are like critical, but that's part of it, but it just becomes something bigger than what you sat and wrote on your.
No book is going to be for everybody, but I think our books find their audience. And I have been just so humbled and felt so warm by those that love Millicent's story.
Yeah, well, I am one of them.
Oh.
But when you were talking about sitting in your office and revising and working and it being so solitary, which it is, all writers know this.
Yes.
What is your process? How do you? And I'm Canadian, for anyone who's listening. That's why I say process and not process. I tried to remind myself to say process, but it didn't happen.
Oh, that's fine.
So what's your process
Have you?
when you're writing?
Well, I do a rough outline. But when it comes to the real nitty gritty of it, because I have a full-time job, which is, it's not just 8 hours a day. It can be 24/7 in and of itself. But I am pretty structured. I have fairly good self-discipline when it comes to working on my book. And so in evenings and weekends, and I take vacation time, staycation time, and I write. I will plan in advance what I'm going to do during, let's say, a week off. And I'll start on a Saturday and I'll write all the way through the whole next week to the following Sunday, which is 9 days.
Yes.
And in those times, I go into essentially lockdown.
Mhm.
I mean, my husband and I will have a quick dinner. I may go out for a walk in the morning, but otherwise I don't leave the house. I don't get in a car. I write 10, 12 hours, sometimes as long as 14 hours for days in a row. And whether I have a goal to get 6 chapters written or revise 15 chapters or whatever it is, I come out at the end of that period with the goal. And I'm like, I like having a list of things to do and marking them off when I get them done. And that's my process. I do what I have to do in the time I have it.
Yeah.
Now, what's yours? I'm thinking I heard you in a talk a few months ago that you have your own approach.
Yeah, my daughter is now 12, but
Mhm.
as a baby and a young child, she didn't sleep. And so she would get up at 3:30 a.m., 4 a.m. for the day. So she trained me to wake early. And she sleeps in now, finally, but I do not. So I am part of this 5 a.m. writers club. I get up every day, usually just before 5 o'clock. And that is when I do the bulk of my creative writing, sort of that time that, you're talking about sitting there for that 10 or 12 hours with no interruptions. And I do that earlier in the morning. And then I use the rest of the day for, because this is my full-time job.
Mhm.
But so there are, as you know, like there's lots of other things that go along with having a book
Yes.
out. There's
Right.
marketing and emails and
Yes.
covers and all those other things that Q&As,
Yes.
So I tend to do that stuff later on or be there for my daughter if she needs my focus and attention. So that's how I've written all my novels, like really in the early hours of the morning. And
Well, you mentioned the early hours of the morning. There is one other little thing in my process that ties into that. When I'm in these periods in particular, when I get in a zone, in
Yeah.
these writing zones, in these periods I just described, in the morning when I wake up, and during those periods I might be writing at 6:30
Yeah.
in the morning, but before I open my eyes, I have discovered about myself that in the morning, before I check my phone for emails or anything else, before I even open my eyes, I just go back to where the story was when I left it the night before, mentally. And it's often during that period that I find solutions to little plot problems I might have. Actually, this works in my career too. I discovered it years ago, even when it comes to things with my job, is those early hours before before I open my eyes and start my day. I can come up with some creative things or solutions during that time. And so I can imagine that when you're writing at 5 in the morning, you might very well be drawing on this well of creative inspiration.
Yeah, it's also just being refreshed. I mean, by
Mhm.
the evening, I've had a whole day of everything that's happened, including, parenting and all the joys that come with that. And so I usually have nothing left in my brain by 8 p.m. So I find in the morning, it's similar to you, although I do it physically where I end my writing session halfway through a scene or halfway through a moment of tension so that when I come back, so that when I'm back in the morning, I haven't finished the scene and then I have to figure out how to pick up the momentum. I leave it in the middle with maybe a note to say, this is where I need to go next. And that way, when I sit down with my coffee, I can just go, right? Because it's
Mhm.
already there. So I think I do what you do. I just do it sitting up with my coffee instead of lying down.
Mhm. Mhm.
But
Interesting.
yeah, it's a good time of day to solve problems because you have slept. So everything has been compartmentalized and put away and you're ready to go.
Yes.
Now I will end it on this question unless you have anything else that you would like to add.
Right.
But tell me, what are you working on next?
Well, I do have another book in the works. And it is another dual timeline story. I love books that take me between past and present because, you get your historical fiction fix and contemporary family drama or whatever. And those are the kinds of books I read all kinds, but I love to read dual timelines. And I'm going back to that. But it will be in a different city and it will be different time period. It'll still be contemporary. And I'm not ready to release where it's going to take place yet, but it will go back to the 1920s Prohibition. When I was writing Millicent, there was, as I indicated earlier, a little bit of research into that period, just because her family had some in the background. But I'm fascinated by it and that whole jazz age and everything. And I really want to learn more about that. And I would love to set a story there. This one, another difference between that and this book, though, will be two main characters, which is sort of like what you did with Recipe for a Perfect Wife, with the contemporary storyline having one main character and the historical having a different one, as opposed to Millicent, where she's the main character in her point of view through the whole book. So there'll be challenges with that, but I'm excited. I think it's going to bring a little bit of a different perspective to that era. And it's going to be a while, but I'm working on it.
That's okay. I mean, it's word by word. This is what,
Yes.
And don't let anyone, there's a lot of talk about, you've already written 2 books. So this is your sophomore project, but technically this will be your 4th book written, right?
Oh, I like thinking of it that way because you're right. People say, oh, the sophomore book can be harder than the
Don't
first.
believe it. I'm
Okay,
here
it's
to
my
tell
4th
you,
book.
Tori, do not believe the hype about the sophomore book being the hardest. I will tell you, my 3rd book was the hardest.
Oh,
so
your
maybe
3rd published book?
My 3rd published book.
Okay.
However, I think there's a lot of this idea that the sophomore project is so hard because you've put everything into your debut and then you have to figure out how to do it again. But don't believe it. You know how to write a book. It'll be amazing. I can't wait to read it.
Oh, thank you.
Get it done. And unless you have anything else to add, I just would like to say, thank you for chatting with me about your amazing book tonight.
Well, I've really enjoyed chatting with you too. And I'm so grateful again to the Atlanta History Center for bringing me in this evening. It's quite an honor after having come to so many events for authors there over the years. And thank you to Foxtail Bookshop too.
Yes,
Shout
out to them.
Seller for books tonight. And we go way back as well. And it's just such a joy to be here. So thank you for reading my book and loving it.
Yes, of course. Well, I really did. And I wish you all
Thank you to those who came virtually, our virtual attendings.
Yes. Thank you so much, everyone. It was great chatting and all the best. I look forward to seeing what's next for you, Tori.
We'll be back in touch. I can see that.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Karma.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.